You're kneeling on cold floor stones in a room that smells of sandalwood and something darker, fear, maybe, or resignation. Your hands are shaking, but you've learned to still them, learned to make yourself smaller, quieter, nearly invisible. Through the paper screens, you hear laughter from the main hall where the noble family celebrates their son's upcoming wedding. You're supposed to be part of that celebration, part of the household's good fortune. But the word they use for UCHM Bangabi bedroom servant means something entirely different from what guests imagine. Tonight, like every night, you'll wait until the house sleeps. And then you'll go where you're summoned. Do what you're commanded, and return to this room before dawn, as if nothing happened. As if you're still a person with a name instead of a function. As if the bruises hidden beneath your jiagori tell no story at all. This is Joseon-era Korea, spanning roughly from the 15th to the 19th century, a time often romanticized for its Confucian ideals, its artistic achievements, its rigid but supposedly orderly social hierarchy. The Yangban, the aristocratic class, lived in graceful Hanok houses with curved roofs and courtyards that whispered cultivation and refinement. They wrote poetry, they practiced calligraphy, they held themselves as moral exemplars, guardians of virtue in a society structured around Confucian principles of propriety, loyalty, and respect. But inside those elegant walls existed a parallel reality, one that the historical records worked meticulously to obscure. A system where young women from lower classes were purchased, assigned, and systematically exploited under the polite fiction of household service. The Joseon court annals mention them only in passing, in euphemistic language that hides more than it reveals. But private letters, court testimonies from rare legal disputes, and the journals of later reformers paint a picture so disturbing that even historians who study this period struggle with how to frame it. Because what happened wasn't an aberration. It was institutional, normalized, written into the very architecture of privilege. The system had a name, though it's one that doesn't appear in official histories. Naja, or inside women, a term that sounds domestic, even protective. In reality, it described a category of servant girls, purchased specifically to serve the sexual needs of the household's men, the master, his sons, sometimes even visiting relatives or important guests. They weren't concubines, who occupied a recognized legal status with certain protections and possibilities for advancement. They weren't even ordinary servants, who could hope for eventual marriage arrangements or retirement. They existed in a shadow category, owned, exploited, and ultimately disposable. Their suffering carefully structured to leave no official trace. Seoi enters a Yangban household in 1627, during the reign of King Injo, a period of political instability following devastating invasions. She's 11 years old. Her family, displaced peasants ruined by war, sells her to a labor broker who specializes in supplying Seoul's noble houses. The transaction is recorded in a household ledger found centuries later. One female, age 11, purchased for service 8 yang silver. 8 yang, roughly the cost of 2 bolts of silk or a decent horse. The ledger doesn't record her name. She's listed simply as new girl, 4th room. She received a name from the household matron, something generic that can be easily forgotten or replaced. For the first year, Seoin's duties appear ordinary: cleaning, preparing meals, assisting with laundry. She sleeps in a small room with 3 other servant girls, all slightly older, all silent in a way that feels less like shyness and more like something broken. The household seems, from the outside, like a model of Confucian order. The master is a minor government official known for his poetry. His wife oversees the women's quarters with stern efficiency. Their 2 sons study for the civil service examinations, their futures bright with expectation. But Seoi begins to notice patterns. The girl who sleeps on the mat beside hers, Minji, barely 14, sometimes disappears in the night and returns near dawn, walking carefully, as if movement hurts. When Seoyun asks where she goes, Minji's face empties of all expression. "You'll learn," she whispers. They all learn. And then, with something that might be pity or warning, the master prefers them young. Before they understand what's happening, he says, "It's purer that way." The system operated on carefully constructed deniability. Officially, these girls were household servants, nothing more. If they became pregnant, and many did, the children were either aborted through brutal herbal methods, administered by the household matron, or, if born, immediately given away or killed. The Confucian code that governed Yangban life placed enormous emphasis on legitimacy, on pure bloodlines. A child born to a Chimbangabi had no legal existence, no claim to anything, not even acknowledgement. They were contradictions that couldn't be allowed to survive because their existence would force the household to admit what it was doing. But here's the detail that reveals the system's true cruelty. It was the women of the household, the wives, the mothers, the daughters, who enforced it most ruthlessly. Not out of sadism necessarily, but out of a desperate need to preserve their own fragile positions. A Yangban wife's status depended entirely on her husband's fidelity being publicly performed, even if everyone knew it was a fiction. So the comfort women had to remain invisible, their suffering unacknowledged, their bodies used, but their existence denied. The household matrons would select which girls went to which rooms, would administer the abortifacients when needed, would arrange the quiet disappearances when a girl became too traumatized to function or too visibly damaged to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Coin is 12 when she's first summoned to the master's quarters. She doesn't understand what's expected until it's happening, and by then resistance isn't possible, not because of physical force, though that threat is always present, but because the household matron has explained the consequences. Resistance means dismissal without the small stipend Seoin's family depends on for survival. It means her younger sister, still at home, will likely be sold next. Means punishment, not just for Seoi, but for everyone connected to her. The system doesn't require consent. It requires complicity, the victim's participation in her own exploitation, structured through economic coercion and familial obligation, so complete that refusal becomes unthinkable. The session lasts less than an hour. Afterward, Seo-yan returns to her room, washes in cold water, and lies awake until dawn. Minji doesn't say anything, doesn't offer comfort. What is there to say? This is the reality they exist in, the function they serve. And tomorrow, the master will attend a Confucian lecture on virtue. His wife will lead prayers at the family shrine. Their sons will recite passages about honor and righteousness. The household will continue its performance of moral superiority, and no one will mention the girl who scrubbed blood from her thighs in the pre-dawn darkness. Historical records from the period reveal the system's scale through indirect evidence. Estate inventories list Chimbangabi separately from other servants, usually in greater numbers than necessary for household tasks alone. Legal documents from the rare cases where abuse resulted in death, and the death became too public to hide show. Judges dismissing charges with language like discipline within household bounds, or unfortunate accident during legitimate service. One case from 1653 involved a 15-year-old servant who died after a forced abortion. The master was fined 3 yang for improper management of property. 3 yang, less than half what he'd paid to purchase her. But the system's true horror lies not just in the individual acts of exploitation, but in how completely it was normalized. Yangban households discussed the management of Chimbangjabi in the same breath as discussing the management of crops or livestock. Private letters between aristocratic women include advice on handling the bedroom girl's recommendations on which herbal mixtures prevent pregnancy most effectively, how to ensure discretion, when to cycle them out before they become too emotionally unstable. One letter discovered in a family archive includes this chilling sentence: "Remember, affection is the enemy of order. Keep them afraid, keep them isolated, and they'll serve their purpose without complication." Seo-yun survives 3 years in the household. She's summoned regularly, sometimes by the master, sometimes by his elder son, once by a visiting cousin. She learns to dissociate, to make her mind go somewhere else while her body remains. She learns which herbal teas prevent pregnancy, administered by the matron with clinical efficiency. She learns that crying results in punishment, not violence, but something worse. Extended isolation in a windowless storeroom where time dissolves and madness feels closer than rescue. Other girls aren't as resilient, or perhaps they're simply less willing to endure. One hangs herself in the servants' quarters, her death recorded in household accounts as terminated service, natural causes. Another attempts to escape and is caught. She's beaten, then sold to a brothel in a provincial town where Yangban households send their problematic servants. It's a warning to the others. This is still the better option. Resist, and things get worse. The Confucian texts that the Yangban men studied endlessly contained beautiful passages about humanity, about treating others with benevolence, about the moral obligations of the superior to the inferior. They memorized these passages, wrote essays on them, used them to justify their social position. But somehow, between the philosophy and the practice, a canyon opened. The same man who could quote Mencius on human nature's innate goodness could summon a terrified 14-year-old to his bed without perceiving any contradiction. Because the Chimbanjabi weren't quite human in the moral calculus, they were closer to property, to instruments, to something that existed outside the sphere where Confucian ethics applied. This wasn't hypocrisy in the simple sense. It was something more sophisticated, a worldview that genuinely believed in moral hierarchy, that structured compassion according to social rank, that saw exploitation not as evil but as the natural order. The Yangban weren't monsters in their own eyes. They were simply using what belonged to them in service of household needs. The Chimbanjabi were fulfilling their social function just as a plow fulfills its function. That the plow might suffer didn't occur to anyone, because suffering requires recognizing personhood, and personhood, in Hosean's rigid hierarchy, wasn't universal. It was earned through birth, through rank, through social position. Those at the bottom existed to serve those at the top. That this service included their bodies was merely an extension of existing logic. When Seoin turns 15, something shifts. The master's wife, increasingly unable to ignore the reality unfolding in her household, begins to view Seoin as a threat. Not because the master might love her, emotion isn't part of this equation, but because Seoin has learned too much, seen too much, exists as a living record of the household's secrets. The wife speaks to the matron. Arrangements are made. One morning, Seoin is told she's being transferred to a rural estate owned by a distant relative. It sounds like a reprieve escape from this house, these rooms, these men. But Minji, who's survived 6 years in this system, knows better. The rural estates, she whispers, are where they send girls who've become inconvenient. You'll work until you can't, and then, ... double quotes, she doesn't finish, she doesn't need to. Seoin is taken by cart to a property 2 days' travel from Seoul. The estate is smaller, more isolated. The master here is older, less concerned with maintaining appearances. There are 4 other Chimbanjabi, all in their late teens or early 20s, all bearing the hollowed-out look of people who've endured beyond their capacity for endurance. One has scars across her face from when she tried to run and was dragged back. Another doesn't speak, hasn't spoken in years, according to the others. The work is harder here, the treatment more openly brutal, because there are no aristocratic visitors to perform virtue for, no neighborhood scrutiny to require the illusion of propriety. Seoin spends 2 years on this estate before something unexpected happens. Reformers begin agitating in Seoul. It's the late 19th century now, the tail end of the Hosan era, and Western ideas about human rights are infiltrating through foreign missionaries and diplomatic contact. Some Korean intellectuals start questioning the rigid hierarchies that have structured society for centuries. A few brave journalists publish exposés about the treatment of servants in Yangban households. The system that relied on silence begins to crack, but change comes too slowly for most. By the time the Korean Empire officially abolishes hereditary slavery in 1894, Seoin is already in her mid-20s, her body worn down by years of exploitation and harsh labor. The abolition doesn't immediately free the Chimbanjabi anyway. It addresses slavery, but doesn't explicitly acknowledge the sexual servitude that existed in a legal gray area. Many households simply reclassified their comfort women as contracted servants and continued as before. The abuse merely renamed rather than ended. A document survived from this transitional period, a petition to a local magistrate from a group of former Chimbangabi asking for assistance, for some form of compensation or protection. The petition is heartbreaking in its careful language in how it tries to describe the indescribable, without being explicit enough to violate the decorum that might convince officials to help. We served in ways not recorded, it says. We bore burdens not acknowledged. We ask only for recognition that we existed, that we served, that we are owed something for years, given that cannot be returned. The magistrate's response, written in the margin, petition denied. Matters of private household are beyond jurisdiction of this court. The system didn't end with a dramatic collapse. It faded gradually as Korea modernized, as Western concepts of individual rights took hold, as the Yangban class itself lost political power. But it faded quietly, without accountability, without restitution, without even widespread acknowledgement that it had existed. The victims aged into invisibility, their stories untold, because speaking them risked social death. In a culture that still prized female purity above all else, to admit you'd been a chimbang was to be marked as ruined, unmarriageable, worthless. So most stayed silent, carried their trauma alone, and died without witness. Modern Korean historians approach this topic carefully, aware of its sensitivity, its parallels to more recent horrors. The research is painstaking because the victims left almost no first-hand accounts. Writing was a privilege of the educated, and the chimbang were deliberately kept illiterate. What survives comes mostly from the oppressor's records, household ledgers, estate inventories, occasional legal documents when exploitation resulted in consequences too public to ignore. The victims' voices are almost entirely absent, their suffering recorded only in the bureaucratic language of property management and household discipline. But one artifact stands out. In 2003, during renovation of a historic Yangban house being converted to a museum, workers discovered a cache of letters hidden beneath floorboards in what had been the servants' quarters. The letters were written by several different hands, none of them skilled, crude characters, awkward grammar, the writing of people who'd taught themselves in secret. They were addressed to mothers, sisters, former friends, but apparently never sent, just composed, perhaps as a way to maintain sanity, to assert that the writer still existed as a person with thoughts and history beyond her function. One letter, dated to the 1880s, is particularly haunting. The writer, who signs only as Forgotten Daughter, describes her life in language that oscillates between factual and poetic, between resignation and barely suppressed rage. "They use our bodies," she writes, "but they cannot have our minds. They own our time, but not our souls. I write this so someone, someday, might know we were here, that we were people, that we mattered, even if only to ourselves." The letter breaks off mid-sentence, unfinished, as if the writer was interrupted or simply couldn't continue. That letter is now displayed in the National Museum of Korean History, behind glass, part of an exhibit on the realities of Joseon-era social hierarchy. The placard beside it uses careful language, domestic servant, late Joseon period. 8, without explicitly naming the sexual exploitation. Even now, even in a museum dedicated to truth-telling, there's a reluctance to fully confront what the system was, as if naming it clearly might somehow implicate the present in the sins of the past. The Yangban houses still stand in some parts of Korea, preserved, protected, celebrated as architectural heritage. Tourists walk through the elegant rooms, admire the courtyard gardens, take photos of the graceful roof lines. The guided tours talk about Confucian values, about the cultivation of moral character, about Korea's cultural golden age. They mention servants, of course, but only in passing. The household was maintained by staff who lived in the outer quarters. Maintained, staffed. The small rooms where the chimbang slept aren't usually on the tour. They're too cramped, too unglamorous, too difficult to romanticize. But they're still there, if you know where to look. Windowless spaces barely large enough for a sleeping mat, tucked away from the main house. Stand in one of those rooms now. The smell of sandalwood is long gone, replaced by the mustiness of old wood and centuries. The floor stones are cold, just as they were when a girl named Esioya knelt on them, making herself smaller, quieter, nearly invisible. The walls hold no inscriptions, no names scratched into the wood. The chimbang left no mark here because they weren't meant to leave marks. They were meant to serve, to suffer in silence, and to disappear as if they'd never existed at all. But absence is also a kind of presence. The silence where their voices should be speaks louder than any recording. The empty rooms where their lives were stolen testify more powerfully than any artifact. They were here. And the fact that we nearly forgot them, that the system almost succeeded in erasing them completely, is perhaps the cruelest thing of all.